Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, Imam Khalid. Welcome to I think this is our second episode. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to keep up. There's a lot going on in the world right now, and we wanted to ensure that, we're continuing to share your experience, because your lived experience, as I have said many times, is so valuable to us, of the younger generation that's involved in social justice. So welcome back.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being back.
So Imam Khalid, global events are always influencing how we think, but the lived African American experience is very unique, where you have been at the brunt of many political and social targeting. You've bore the brunt of some of these targets. How have you navigated in your life as a social justice activist? And I'd like you to start a little early, from when you were younger, and what fueled you, and what from your life fueled you to keep going, even though there were so many setbacks, I imagine.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And I would have to say that even though it may not have been directly involved in, well, let me start over. I would have to say that my father was perhaps my first influence about social justice. He was a trade unionist, and he was the second African American to become a full-time labor organizer for an international labor union in the South. And so my household was constantly filled with other people from the civil rights movement and from the labor movement coming to visit my father, and they were always strategizing about something. And we went with trips on many of the other organizers and civil rights workers. So from a very young age, I knew that something was amiss, that it wasn't just a childhood that was free of any kind of concerns beyond getting candy and this kind of thing. I was constantly listening to discussions about inequities and injustices and the responsibility to address these things. When I reflect back on it, some of my even junior high school, middle school kids thought I was nuts when I would sing labor songs, labor union songs that my father had taught me, Solidarity and all these different songs, and they really stuck with me. But I think that after going into high school, I went to high school in a predominantly almost all white high school, because it was a school that at that particular time, the school system was segregated. And because of the segregated school system, you had, of course, the school for white kids, school for black kids. At that particular time, there were just a handful of folks who would be identified as non-black or non-white in the school system during that particular time. And because I was in a class, I was in a grouping of young African-American kids who were considered academically gifted. And they had similar classes for grade levels for the white kids, but we went to separate schools. We went to segregated schools. But in high school, they had the enlightened thought that maybe we'll allow these kids to go to the same school. So I ended up, and those who were in the same school and classes that I was in, we ended up going to the big Society Hill School that they called it. This was a school when many of the children of the business owners, R.J. Reynolds' children and grandchildren and others, actually went to the school. And my senior year, and it was just, as I said, a relative handful, I guess, out of, can't imagine, I can't remember the number of students there. It was a large high school, but we had a relatively small African-American population in the school. But my senior year, I was involved, and some say organized, a walkout of all of the African American students because of some of the injustices. It started around most, I'm not going to say most, but many of the African American males were athletes there. And, but they would not have or allow African American cheerleaders. So on my way, walking on the campus, getting ready to go to class, students start coming up to me, talking to me. I don't want to get stuck in this high school story, so I'll try to bring this to an end.
Oh, it's good.
No, actually,
good. Yeah, we're following you. Yeah.
We're imagining
Yeah.
a movie in our head.
Okay.
Bring up our jacket.
Yeah. So students, black students, start coming up to me, telling me that there were no black girls selected for the cheerleaders the evening before. And my initial response was, "Why are you telling me? What I have to do with that? Why are you telling me?" And after about 4 or 5 people said something to me about it, I finally said, "Well, look, why don't you all go to every classroom in this big high school? Don't ask for permission, open the door, and just tell the black students there to walk out of class, come down, go to the cafeteria. We're walking out." And out of all of the black students there were only 2 that didn't get up and come down. And so my actual interaction with activism, my personal activism, probably started at that particular time. And after that particular experience, and being in North Carolina, where we had Malcolm X University had been established about 1 or 2 years before my senior year in high school, the organizer of Malcolm X Liberation University, his name at that time was Howard Fuller. He changed it to Owusu Sadikai. He also organized the African Liberation Day ceremony. I think it started in 1972. And in some form goes all the way up to today in Washington, D.C. It used to be a big, huge, tremendous event. And Owusu was one of the people, as I said, that I met because of this boycott. He had come to Winston-Salem from Durham, and he wanted to meet with some of the organizers of this walkout because it was something extraordinary for the city, for this particular school to have any kind of ruckus. It wasn't used to that. There was no fighting or anything, but it caught the public's attention. And so he came up and he wanted to speak with me. And I remember meeting him in an apartment close to the campus. And he gave me some very, very sound advice. If you're going to continue on this path, be prepared. You're going to catch a lot of flack. You're going to get attention, undesired attention. And he was, of course, a few years much older than me. And so from that, it sort of seemed like a springboard or a continuation of what my father had instilled in me. And I was hooked from that moment. And of course, went away to university.
Where were you in your senior year of high school?
What year?
Yeah.
This was 1969.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So,
I was
pivotal time in
Yep.
the civil rights movement, essentially.
Absolutely. Yeah. Dr. King had been martyred in 1968, in April of 1968. And it was a very pivotal time in the city where I live. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was organized in 1968. It had a leadership then that, rather than being called, I don't want to denigrate their efforts, but at that particular time, they will call the Black Party, the Black Party Panthers. And the party was emphasized whenever they said that, because basically it seemed like more of a social club at that particular time and a social gathering place rather than the activist movement as it was represented across the country. But once they got new leadership of the organization, it truly changed. There was a brother who I had actually gone to this high school with. He was a year ahead of me, who became the head of the organization. And that Black Panther Party actually was a regional headquarters in Southeast United States for the Black Panther Party itself, or the National Black Panther Party. And so I just, unfortunately for me, I was leaving the city when this leadership got in place of the party. Otherwise, and it was a lost cause, because otherwise I would have just stayed there, not gone away to college at that time, and just worked with the Black Panther Party. But when I got to Washington, D.C., where I went to school at Howard University, my freshman and sophomore years, I used to, on Saturdays, uh, go downtown, go to the Panther headquarters, which was close to the campus, go downtown and sell the paper, the Black Panther Party papers, and do some other things with them. At that point, I felt strongly that I was just going to go all the way with the Black Panther Party. I may or may not stay in school. And I did this for a while. I was right there with them. I was right there in DC, but I was turned off by the lack of, I guess, religious guidance, because most of the folks who were in there, were just denying God. That's something else. You need to get out of here with that. But also the sense of, I objected and didn't voice objection, but for me, the personal male-female interactions, to me, were not appropriate for those who were espousing a higher consciousness or trying to bring people to a higher consciousness. So,
and you
those
were
are the
right? Were you Muslim at this point?
No, I was not Muslim at this point.
Okay.
And so after, so 2 years of that involvement with the Panthers, I started searching, because I felt at that particular time that the Panthers was not for me. So I started looking into, Marxism, Leninism. I was going with groups of the Maoists and Trotskyites. And in DC, you had anything you could imagine, and you had all the literature.
You cut off, like, so you're Trotskyyites. We lost you for a few seconds.
Wow. Yeah. So with the Trotskyites and you name it, all during this time, though, I was very heavily involved in the anti-war movement. And in Washington, D.C., I mean, every single week, at least once a week, every Saturday during this particular period, there were anti-war protests, people coming from all across the country. And I was one of the few students that I knew about from Howard University who would go down there in these anti-war protests. I would be down at the selling papers with the Panthers up until about 1 o'clock. And I would leave from downtown selling papers, and even take the papers down to the anti-war protests, because it was something my father had instilled in me, this imperialist mentality, and the people he was hanging around. So I couldn't get into the imperialism. As a matter of fact, he actually told me that I would never, he didn't care if I were drafted, what they did. He said, "You'll never go to Vietnam." I said, "Really?" I said, "Well, what's going to happen?" He said, "Well, I'm going to send you to Canada." And so his plan for me was, if you get drafted out of college, you're going to Canada. I was on my way to Toronto. He had it all figured out. And
wow. Only missed out.
Yeah, you all landed Sheikh Abdullah Hakim quick instead. Yeah, alhamdulillah. Because that's what brought Sheikh Abdullah Hakim to Canada.
Oh,
he
wow.
Was,
no idea.
Yeah, he was involved in the draft, and he went to Toronto as a draft dodger, or what was considered a draft dodger. Yeah.
Well, those are loaded terms, draft dodgers, people who are anti government if they don't ascribe to these views. But as a government, if we are promoting war or some sort of ideology that's going to marginalize a group or assault on such a large scale, it's funny that language plays such a big piece in how you think of yourself and how you think of your society.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. As a matter of fact, this whole expression, I mean, you nailed it, because how we are named, I mean, what labels are attached to us are very, very powerful. And this draft dodger, I came from a mentality that, and I was saying draft dodgers because this is just how they have referred to people, like my father wanted me to be if I actually got. But the folks, I had this mentality at that time that those were the people, when someone told me some label that maybe some of my friends were talking about some of my other friends that I had grown up with, and they said, well, this crazy guy, we know he was crazy, but now he's in the Panthers, or now he's in this group, or now he's involved with those things. And from high school on, that was attractive to me. I said, right, this guy got something on his head other than acting crazy and getting high. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, growing up in Montreal, I had a lot of teachers when I was in elementary and high school who were draft dodgers. They
Canada was, I guess, a haven.
Yeah, it was. Well, it was like
Really?
and I don't want to compare it, but it was like the idea of the Underground Railroad kind of like inspired future. I don't want to say draft dodgers, but avoidance
Right.
of American policies and that. What I wanted to double click on one thing. It's interesting how history repeats itself and how we forget. So certain people who defied going to Vietnam, like Muhammad Ali, Allah yarhamu, are now celebrated. But today, as you know, there are many issues happening in the world, but the one that's a hot button issue today is what's going on in Palestine and Gaza. And if anybody, people are losing their jobs for being pro-Palestinian, not anti-Semitic, just being pro-Palestinian. They're being arrested. Even the Jewish Voices for Peace did a huge sit-in at the Central Station in New York. There was several, I think hundreds, who were arrested, thrown in jail. What are your thoughts on like the fact that history repeats itself, yet those who are in charge will celebrate and give the medals 10 years from now to those who went to prison but can't remember that this already happened? What do you think, as a person who's a student of history?
Yeah. I think that's it's not a new phenomenon. As you said, it's historical occurrence. I think when you're no longer a threat, you're no longer perceived as a threat after you're dead or after you get 90 years old or something like that. So it's easier to identify with the actual history and contributions of a person in this society, even in Canadian society, perhaps, but in American society, definitely from the entire whitewashing of the African people of African descent's history in the United States. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of thought to suppress history the way that this nation has been able to suppress the history. So it starts much earlier than people like Muhammad Ali, people like Malcolm X, who this government just vilified for so much, and the press just vilified him so much when he was alive. But then a relative few years later, he's on a U.S. postal stamp, and he's being celebrated and commemorated in the mail because of this postal stamp. So it's a phenomena that goes back to as far as
yeah. You know what I found very interesting was I can't remember what his name is. He's a host for a CNN TV show. can't
I'll look it up while
yeah, he's amazing, mashallah. I find he's a comedian who does black content related to black issues, and he said when you read, I'm paraphrasing obviously, when you read the history of United States, you are pulled into two narratives: that Malcolm X was extremely militant, and that so they've increased his militancy, whereas they've completely erased the militancy of Dr. Martin Luther King, whereas he was much more engaged in those discussions than and very much capable of drawing those crowds and causing that emotional effect that resulted in the change that we have, right? Obviously, all of their work resulted in something, right? But well, you got his name?
Yeah, W. Kamau Bell,
Yeah.
United Shades of America. He had a show on
Right.
CNN.
Right.
So he spoke about how we've changed the narrative on what the change makers were identified as, or how they were viewed in history, right? And I think that's what happens, and we've seen that with Canadian figures, obviously. But it's just devastating. Obviously, we hear that about Muslims in history as well. So it's really reframing that whole thing. So I actually wanted to use this as a segue to go back to your high school years. Basically, during your formative years, you saw the assassinations that impacted the whole nation, and in fact the whole world, occurring at a time when you were just growing into your own. I think it's very important to talk about this right now, because I wouldn't know how you wouldn't feel defeated after two of the most impactful figures in your, in any sort of activist movement, two or three or four. I mean, depending on how you look at it, you could add the Kennedys in there as well. How did that impact how you felt about yourself as a teenager, how you felt about yourself as a Black man growing up in a society that didn't want to celebrate your voice?
That's an excellent question. When I think about it, I have to be reminded that personalities and figures like Malcolm X and Dr. King spawned hundreds, if not thousands, of little Malcolms and little Kings. And what the media was very skillful at doing was to give the impression, and this was directed at the civil rights movement in particular. There were a lot of different movements going on in the 60s and the early 70s. But specifically, this particular tactic was directed at the civil rights movement. And that was the tactic of trying to identify people like Dr. Martin Luther King in particular as the sole spokesperson for all of African America, and that he was the voice of every person who wanted social change as it related to civil rights in the United States. And he was a remarkable, towering, once in a generation kind of figure. But what the media in the United States was very effective in doing was to diminish and not allow those who were on the local levels and the local communities who were actually doing the groundwork. There were tremendous figures all across the country, and Dr. King and those Jesse Jackson, who was younger than King, but those who came who were very articulate and charismatic and could mobilize and organize and these kind of things. They would come into these various cities where demonstrations were being organized and held. And then, of course, they would go on to the next city. But it was the local populations that bore the actual brunt of the racist resistance against those who were just trying to get their God-given rights, just being a human being. And so I never forget, I was in I think it was some kind of some type of sociology class in the 11th grade. And my teacher was a white female. She was an elderly lady, elderly for me at that time. And she was very socially conscious, and she was very sensitive to the civil rights movement. And I never forget her asking me the next day after Dr. King was assassinated in class, how did I feel about what had happened? Did I actually feel that this was going to be a stopping point for civil rights and this kind of advancement in civil rights because of his murder, assassination, or what did I feel about it? And I remember saying to her, you know, for me it was hard to judge because he didn't speak for all the voices, African American voices in this country, and there were so many talented individuals around him that this struggle would just continue. And so it was left up to the Western media to pick their next person that they're going to, you know, hype up and give the ink to. But after a while, particularly as the Black freedom struggle dimension of the civil rights trek or this freedom movement for African American people in the country, as it moved forward, what began to happen is that um, more individuals um, were highlighted in their individual communities, and we took what Dr. King was saying and appreciated it and took the good things from it. But also there was this person, Malcolm X, and there also were the disciples of Malcolm, like Imam Jamil Al-Amin, H. Rap Brown, like Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. If the African American community, if it's had anything, we've had our fair share of very charismatic, eloquent, fiery organizational geniuses, social organizational geniuses. And and all of these chose social activism over the pursuit of quote unquote more legitimate career paths. Stokely was a brilliant guy. Imam Jamil is a very brilliant man. Uh, so many of these Huey P. Newton is a brilliant guy. There were so many brilliant people. Kathleen Cleaver, just so many brilliant people. Elaine Brown, I could just name after name. These people were thoughtful folks. They weren't just empty vessels that people were, you know, just pouring things into. They were thinkers and they were movers, and they had the kind of courage that, you know, I saw on my visits. I've been over to Palestine on 3 different occasions over the years. Once before Gaza, before the boycott on Gaza and the closure of the borders, so nobody can get in there. And twice after the closure of the borders. And what I saw in interacting with the brothers and sisters I interacted with in Gaza and West Bank, and particularly in the camps, was a kind of courage that is so, I mean, it's so inspirational. You're fueled by seeing people stand up for justice in the manner that they stood for justice. And I liken that in my own limited experiences here in the United States, that just seeing people with the courage to stand up in the face of these racist, crazy folks, whether they were in the north of the country or the south of the country, the police, the brutality of the police and these kind of things, and to see people have the courage to stand up against this, and face it down, even to the point of being just killed, but face this down. It reminded me, and something hit me in my heart when I was in Palestine, and particularly in Gaza, because in Gaza I spent time sleeping in these refugee camps, and it's really painful, additionally painful for me, because I've been in some of those camps that you're seeing on the news, I in Rafah, in that refugee camp, and I'll be quite honest with you. Um, uh, I ran across a number of in camps on West Bank and camps in Gaza, and these were young people, and it was so courageous, and it got me so inspired that I don't know if this what will happen. I'm not going to go all the way into it, but it inspired me to take risks while I was there that um, uh, I couldn't put
Yeah.
it together any other way. Yeah, but it's just something in the face of that kind of oppression. It's difficult, and for me, it's almost impossible to not do something. And so the minimum activity of any social justice, in my humble opinion, is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has just graded our levels or expressions of faith. And the least thing that we can do is hate stuff in our heart, not be silent compatriots in injustice. But then going up the scale, if we're in a position to speak out, if that's all we can do, then that's what we have to do. And so I think that the sooner that spirit is transmitted and the spirit is infused, and parents of children, and particularly our Muslim kids, but anyone who has a social justice agenda, you can't be a coward and be a genuine social justice advocate. You can't be scared. I mean, it's not a reckless kind of not being afraid, but we have to be willing to sacrifice. And oftentimes that sacrifice means it can mean different things in different circumstances. And from the context of the historical context of African Americans in this country, based on our historical experience, it has been nothing but struggle against, even up until today, with the mass incarceration and this kind of thing. So it's, over the years, from high school up until this very moment, there have been enough domestic injustices to keep me busy, not just running from issue to issue, because I want to be more grounded than that. But it's a never ending opportunity to get involved and be inspired by the courage of other people. And that kind of fuels you when you get out there to do these kinds of things.
I just want to. So one of the things that I find inspiring about what you're saying is something that I've been thinking a lot about, because there's a lot of Muslims that are trying to be active now, whether it be on their social media or in the protests. Thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people around the world are going out and protesting for Palestine, as they did actually during the George Floyd era. Not that it's over, but and one of the things that I see, there's a lot of misinformation. Even some, I don't want to say false imams, but imams saying activism is haram, is bid'ah, all sorts of other stuff. And one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is, in Islam, the most basic element of do no harm is there. If there's a piece of rock on the road and you move it to the side, you get good deeds, you get hasanat. So that's a form of activism on some level, or a form of safety, or a form of do no harm. So imagine if that gives you hasanat. Imagine going out and, as you said, standing in the face of injustice, and expressing yourself and helping the people, taking risks. I think it's important for us to know, and it's important for us to learn from the likes of yourself and your peer group, because you, alhamdulillah, you're wearing two hats. You're a Muslim, but you're also African American, and you went through that struggle. And I think it's important for us to learn from it and be inspired by it. You wanted to ask something?
No, this is just so much to think about and so much to unpack. Um, while we are on the topic, though, I have to ask, what do you say to the fear? Because I think you lived through that fear, the fear of speaking to power.
Mhm. You know, it's just as there's strength in Jamaat, right? And we're commanded even in making salah. We need to feel each other. We can, you know, Allah bring our hearts together. We can bond and feel the strength of one another just by standing shoulder to shoulder, foot to foot. I mean, it's a level of strengthening that we can't see. I mean, we know we're trying to close the ranks, but Allah has given us a perfect deen in order for us to work together collectively. As individuals, we are very limited in any of us of what we can do. But when we come together, that's where our unity and strength comes. And uh, I don't advise any young person or anyone who's uh, interested and concerned in social justice um, and social justice pursuit to be a lone wolf, right? And I'm not talking about doing anything illegal or anything like that, but there is strength in our unity, in our numbers, and I think that this gave all of us, no matter what the circumstances we were in, um, it strengthened us when we came together, uh, and 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 know that in my heart, deep down inside, it's not that you're not afraid, but you do what we have to do in spite of the fear. You stand there knowing that some crazy cop, or in so many contexts in the United States, some racist, uh, some person just so consumed by their own racism, you may be standing in a demonstration like we had in Minneapolis, Minnesota, just about a week and a half ago. And there was a pro-Palestine demonstration. And this racist deliberately drove his truck into that crowd. And they said people were just being hit up in the air, you know, up in the air like it was a movie or something.
You cut off. You said this individual.
Okay, as an and can you hear as an
Yeah.
individual, if you're out there by yourself and you're experiencing that, and you're seeing one person standing there get hit, then as an individual, you're gonna say, "Well, I'm not going out there. You know, I don't think I'm ready to do that because of what may happen." But when you see just crowds and crowds of people out there and it happens, then you helping each other and you're strengthening each other, and then you're waiting for the next demonstration. You're going to the next thing. Let me give you a little story and some of my anti-war stories, my demonstrations down on the monument. Because in DC, this was the place, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of people gathered there. So this was before becoming Muslim. And unless I was coming straight from the Panther office going downtown to demonstrate in the anti-war stuff, I had this bell-bottom jeans, which the wide flare.
Yeah.
Yeah, no hat. No, I never did that. But the
No.
We need pictures, Imam. We need pictures.
yes, okay, and had blue jeans, bell-bottom blue jeans, and I took an American flag about this size, and I burned it a little bit, you know, like a quarter of an inch on each corner of the flag. I sewed the flag on the back sides, on the behind of my jeans, had the flag turned upside down and sewed it on the back of my jeans. So Richard Nixon, I mean, that's the scariest times other than these times we're living in now. He was the scariest president, and I don't care what anybody says, and from a certain time period, this guy was scary. He was a fool and a fanatic. And so he had a goon squad. They would pull up police. They would pull up in these panel trucks. And it may be just the sight of them, but it looked like all of them were about 6'5", 6'6", big dudes, a lot of black dudes, and they're big old guys. And they'd have these shield on one arm. I mean, like 5-foot shields to protect themselves. And they have these long billy clubs like this. And it looked like it was Poland or Czechoslovakia, or, communist Russia or something, the way that it would jump out the back of these vans. And so after a while, you saw, you would see thousands of people, but almost every week you're seeing basically with all these people, you're running across people you've been in demonstrations with before. And so after a while, I think the cops identified that too. And these guys would come into certain areas and just start beating people down, the demonstrators beating them down. And it got to the point that they started looking for me because of my desecration of the flag, sewing it on my behind and having it upside down and burning the corners. And it was funny, man. They would jump out the vans, they park on the hill, and they run down the hill. And my crew that I was running with, and the section I would be, run, talking to me, get out, and they would help protect me by getting me away so the cops wouldn't beat me down. Because you could see it. They had face shields on too. Some of them had the face shields up. They were crazed, man. They were like mad animals just turned loose, hunting. And but I was young and crazy, and to me that was exciting. But I wouldn't have done any of that if it were just me alone. And so, I strongly believe that organization, just as in Islam, Jamaat, organized efforts, the Salah and everything else, that's where the strength is. It's not in us one or two doing little acts. That's not going to change anything. But when we come together collectively and find ways to overcome, if you're not fearful of something, something's wrong with you. You're nuts. We need to get therapy. Fear is a law-given quality, a protection quality. It's fight or flight. There's time to do both. You don't stand there. When I knew those guys were coming to beat me, I'm not going to try to play bad guy and stand there and talk jump and let them beat me down with those billy clubs. So everyone has a degree, a level of fear, but it should never turn to cowardice, where it paralyzes us from doing what's good for us, this world, and what will be good for us in the next world. As you talk about the hasana, for just removing, some obstacle on the road for other people.
Well, one thing I would touch on from here is fear. You talked about fear, but let's look at fear from the other end, the perceived fear of a young activist. Why are certain actions acceptable from some groups and not others? Because, you are a harmless, university protester, right? You went off to, get your university degree. You've been a social justice warrior. To this day, there was no incarceration involved and stuff like that. I see you as an inspiration, but also as someone who really probably got targeted just for being. And if your times called for it, you responded to a call to action. But and I always give the example of Kyle Rittenhouse, who was allowed to walk through, protests with a rifle, and whoever died at his hands, being completely acquitted of whatever he was accused of, is kind of devastating. What do you think of this dual narrative that we have to live with, that we eventually internalize?
Yeah, you're asking some very, very good questions, and that's another good one. It's one of the realities of Western society for the most part. It's one of the unfortunate realities. And I think that if we put things in a historical context, we didn't just pop up whenever we were born, and for our generation, we didn't just spring out from nothing. There are roots there. And the Western nations use this as the context, have a have were formed. I'll say, yeah, Western nations this side of the Atlantic were formed from settler colonialism. They settled, they took people's land and settled on their land and marginalized, if not just exterminated, the people who were on the land. Just genocide, just wiped them up. That's how United States, in a very clear way, Canada in a similar way, but not as extreme in this genocidal process of indigenous people as we've had in the United States. And so this process of getting to the point where there are at least two different sets of justice and two different standards of how societal so-called legal justice is to be implemented. It starts a long time ago. It didn't start in the 60s, 1960s. It started from the formation of these countries. And I think sometimes, and it's kind of, I'm not going to say, it's almost a point of disappointment, but much stronger than disappointment to see particularly the Muslim community not understand certain social and political realities in the nations that where we're living. And what I mean by that is that I do, involved with a number of different things. One thing I'm work with this group, Institute for Dismantling Racism. And in some of the work that we do through the Institute, it's just amazing how folks are just so unaware of this dual system and feel that the system is made for everybody. Why are you all criticizing this and criticizing that? Everyone has the opportunity. No one is being restrained from being the best that they can be and this kind of thing. So when we see people like this Rittenhouse guy travel multiple states line with this weapon of mass destruction that his mama brings him across these states lines to go and kill people, to walk down past all of these police officers who are there to break the skulls if anybody who's demonstrating gets out of hand or just shows any kind of resistance. And this guy, as you alluded to, just walks through past the cops, kill people, walk back out, gets tried in a so-called court of law, and he's acquitted. Nothing happens to him. And after that, he becomes a celebrity.
Hero.
He's a hero. Yeah. He's lauded. It's like this is a savior for some kind of movement. And but it's not surprising because those two standards of justice have always existed here. It's never been a time in this country where Black or Native American or other lives, but particularly Black and Native American in a context of the United States, there's never been a time when there's been a true acknowledgement of the basic humanity of folks. And once you dehumanize a people, then you can do anything to them, like what this mad dog Netanyahu is doing, and what he's doing over in Gaza right now. These are not people, these are human animals. And this is the mentality of those folk. They've dehumanized the Palestinians to the point that what they're doing to them is like killing wolves or foxes who running in, stealing your chickens or something like that.
Wow, that's Imam, I feel like I can talk to you for a very, very long time about these issues. Your lived experience is uncomparable, and we're blessed that you're giving us this time to reflect backwards and at our current state as the Ummah. I really appreciate your time, and inshallah next time, we have a discussion, hopefully some of this will have resolved itself. Unfortunately, we don't see an end anytime soon, but we will continue to make dua. So I truly appreciate your time.
Also, because before we end, I want to say, inshallah, next time we want to discuss more about kind of your youth and the formative years. And I also want to address some of the Canadian history, because like when recently, I mentioned to you that we took a course on active bystander training, and as part of that, we learned about the history of racism in Canada. Canada has some very bloody hands too. Maybe it wasn't as bloody as the Americans, but they still committed genocide. They still committed atrocities on different levels, and there were policies that were extremely racist. And some provinces have passed racist policies recently. I'm not going to name who, anti-hijab, anti-whatever, but it's still there, right? So we'll talk about that later. But jazakallah khair for your time.
Thank you so much, Imran.